Hey friends, today I'm going to be giving you the lowdown on all things drugstore blushes. So I've actually tried a lot of drugstore blushes, I've realized. I was going through my collection and realizing like I have mostly drugstore blushes, and I think that's because the drugstore just does blushes so well. I really don't think you need to spend high-end prices on blushes. I do have a few high-end blushes that I enjoy, but for the most part I think the drugstore is where it's at. So I have 13 blushes to share with you today. Some of them I've already either decluttered or used up, but I'm still going to talk about them. And I'm actually going to go in order of price, starting with the most expensive and getting down to the most affordable. Because even though these are all drugstore, there is quite a range in prices at the drugstore, as I'm sure you've probably noticed. So there's, a little bit of something for every price point here. I'm going to tell you the best and worst and the in-between of all the ones that I've tried. Let's go ahead and start with the most expensive, which also happens to be one of my favorites. This is the Flower Beauty Flower Pots blush, and I have the shade Sweet Pea. This is the one that I'm wearing on my cheeks today. This one retails for $11.49, so it is not a cheap drugstore product, but you can, of course, often find Flower Beauty on sale for like 30% off on Ulta or even on the brand's website, so wait around for a sale and you can definitely get a better deal. But I actually would say this is worth the slightly higher price because I can just tell a little bit of a difference in the quality and just the overall experience of using this. First of all, it just feels to the touch very silky smooth, and it blends the same way, just effortless to blend. This particular shade, Sweet Pea, is matte, but they do have some glowy ones in this line as well, some really beautiful shades. All of the shades in this line look stunning that I kind of would like to get more at some point, but Sweet Pea is just the perfect cool-toned baby pink color. I think the packaging is super cute. I love that it has like the rose imprint in it. So that is one of my favorites, the Flower Pots blush. Now Flower actually makes another blush for the same price that I do not recommend. It's the Blush Bomb. Specifically the shade Pinched, that's the one that I've tried. I haven't tried any other shades, so maybe some other shades will be better, but Pinched, I realized, just had barely any color payoff. I mean, I could even pile it on and I would just get the most subtle, barely there color, which, if that's what you're going for, if you like a really subtle blush, you might enjoy that. But that blush was just so sheer that it was almost invisible, and I think for the price and just for the effort that it takes to apply a blush, I don't think it's worth it. I just think there are better liquid blushes out there, better cream blushes, so I would skip that one, personally. Another one I would skip, this one's very popular, and it's been around for a while, also $11. This is the Milani Rose Blush. It actually looks very similar to the Flower blush. This one I had for a long time. I decluttered it a while ago. Back in like 2016, I really liked this blush. I thought it was a good one, but since then I've just tried so many other formulas that I realized that one is just not that good. It was very dry, very hard to get any color payoff on the cheeks. It also got hard panned really easily. And I just think if you want a blush that has that same look to it with the beautiful, rose imprint, just go for one of the Flower Pots ones. This one is worlds better. Just the texture is so much smoother. It's so much easier to work with. So I would skip the Milani Rose Blush as well. That's one of my least favorites at the drugstore, or just across the board. Even though I didn't like the Milani Rose Blush, Milani actually does make some of my favorite blushes. First up, the Cheek Kiss Cream Blush. This has been one of my favorites this year. I've been raving about it all year long. This is an amazing cream blush. If you like a sort of dewy but not too sticky, tacky cream blush in a compact like this, definitely check this one out. I have the shade Nude Kiss. Now the only thing I will say is that the shade Nude Kiss online looked way different from the way it actually looks in person. I was expecting it to be like a mauve-y brownish rose, but it's really more like a pinky rose. Like, it's pretty pink actually. So the shade is way different from what I was expecting, but luckily I do really like this shade also, and I do think the shade you're seeing on camera is much more true to what it looks like in person. Just keep in mind, if you're shopping online, make sure that you look up swatches of the shade that you're getting so that you know what color you're actually getting. But aside from that, this is an incredible cream blush. I think it beats the Tower 28 cream blush. It has a nice dewy look on the cheeks. There's no shimmer to it though. It just gives you that kind of plump, juicy look. There's also something about this that just makes my cheeks look even smoother than they actually are. Not in like a mattifying, blurring sort of way, but more in a plumping way. It just makes my cheeks look so hydrated and healthy, but it's not too thick and sticky at the same time. I just love this one. It's one of my favorites of all the ones I'm talking about today, and I think if you're new to cream blushes especially, I think this would be a good one to start with. Another one from Milani. This is the same price as the other two. This one has been around for forever. It's the Milani Baked Blush in Luminoso. This absolutely lives up to the hype. Even though it's been around for years, it still is one of the, I think, one of the best blushes on the market. It is very glowy. Whenever I do wear this, I typically skip highlighter because I just don't feel like I need any more glow than what this gives. But even though it is very glowy and sheeny, it doesn't enhance texture on my cheeks. It doesn't look too metallic. It just looks very glassy and glowy. This is one of my favorite blushes to wear in the summertime, especially. I feel like this shade always just makes me look like I'm more tan than I actually am, and it's just beautiful. I have heard from some of you guys that some of the baked blushes do have some kind of chunky glitter to it, but this one does not. This one has a very fine sheen. It's stunning. Absolutely lives up to the hype. Now we've gotten into the blushes that are under $10, so we're getting into slightly more affordable drugstore prices now. This one has been very hyped up this year, but I think it is totally worth the hype. This is the NYX Sweet Cheeks Blush, and I have the shade Nude Tude. This shade is that perfect kind of spicy brown rose color. I've been loving it this fall and winter. Even though this has a doe foot applicator, it's very easy to blend out. I was a little worried that it would go on patchy or that it would just cling to one spot, but I will just put a few dots on my cheeks and then blend it out with a brush, and it blends so quickly. This one does have more of a matte finish, but it's not like a very silicone-y feeling matte or anything. And to me, this has that perfect level of pigment where you don't have to be too careful with it, but it's also not so sheer like the Flowered Blush Balm where it's not going to show up. It's very buildable, just very easy to work with, and I think once again, if you're new to cream blushes and liquid blushes, I do think this would be a great one to check out. Another one of my favorites, these retail for $8. These are the Kokie Soft Gradient blushes, especially the shade Bellissima. This one has been one of my favorites of the year. This is what really got me started with red blushes. If you haven't tried like a warm red blush, I'm just saying, I think it's a very underrated shade, and I think it can be very flattering. It gives you that kind of sun-kissed look without actually having to get any real sun damage. This, I would say, has been one of my most used blushes of the whole year. I also have the shade Star-Crossed, which is a really fun pink. This one is great if you're into that really fun bubblegum pink that's been very popular this year. I've heard that this is supposed to be a dupe for that Dior pink blush that was all the rage earlier this year. I haven't tried that Dior blush, but I definitely can see that this has a similar shade. When you just swirl your brush throughout the whole pan, you do get a very similar, like, soft baby pink blush. The only thing with a gradient blush like this I do want to point out, because I think it would probably get on some people's nerves, is the fact that you do have to be sure to place your brush in the same spot for both cheeks and make sure that you get a consistent amount of each color on your brush each time. Otherwise, like, let's say with Bellissima, if I accidentally got more of the red and less of the peach on one side, and then the other side I got more peach and less red, my cheeks are going to be two different colors. I don't feel like that's been a huge issue for me with these, but I do want to point that out just because I don't think these are necessarily as beginner friendly or as just like effortless or mindless to use versus something like the Flower Pots blush, which you could practically apply with your eyes closed. It's, you know, that easy. These just take a little bit more thought, and they also are pretty pigmented compared to a lot of the other powder blushes that I'm talking about today. But despite all of that, I have been loving these this year, and Bellissima, like I said, has been one of my most used blushes of 2022. Next, we have another relatively recent launch. This is the e.l.f. Luminous Putty Blush. I have this in the shade Maui. I love this shade. This kind of reminds me of my longtime favorite, the Cloven Hallow Hydra Tint blush in Blossom, which I actually used up earlier this year, but it has that same neutral, nude, soft pink color that just goes with everything. And this one has like a golden sheen to it, which is really pretty. This one, if you don't like a very luminous blush though, I would definitely skip this one. For some reason I was expecting this to be like a cream to powder formula because, you know, I've tried like the putty face primer from e.l.f. and that one has that silicone-y, powdery matte feel and finish. But this is nothing like that. This doesn't really dry down. It doesn't really set into place. It does not only have that sheen from the actual shimmer in it, but it also has like a dewy, somewhat tacky texture. So it's not exactly what I was expecting it to be, but I do still think it's really pretty. You just have to be careful not to go overboard with this and not apply too much, or you will, your cheeks will just look a little too metallic. This one also no highlighter necessary. This is really like a 2-in-1 blush and highlighter. The only other con I'll point out is that the pot itself is kind of small. So some brushes that I might normally use for a cream product are just a little too big to fit in there. So I have to be sure that I'm using a small enough brush, or I'll just apply it with my fingers. That hasn't really been a huge issue for me, but I did just want to point that out as well. So while I do really enjoy this one, it's not my all-time favorite cream blush. I think while some people would really enjoy it, other people would probably hate it. So I would say only get this if you really want a very shiny luminous blush, because that's what it is. Another one from e.l.f. This one's been around for a lot longer. This is the primer-infused blush, and I have the shade Always Cheeky. This is one of the matte ones. I know they also do make a glowy version of this that does have shimmer to it. This, I would say, has a similar, very velvety, smooth feel to the Flower Pots blush. So if you like the sound of the flower one, but you wanted something a little bit cheaper, I think this one would be great. Honestly, I don't find myself using this that often, but it's not because I don't like it. I think it's because lately I've just been more into cool or neutral tone blushes, and this one is obviously very warm and peachy, but hopefully I'll come around and get some more use out of this in the spring and summer of next year, because it is a really pretty formula. And I think the idea behind the primer-infused name is it's just meant to be like a long-lasting blush. Primer, you know, primer makes your makeup last longer, so that's kind of the idea behind it. I think it's kind of gimmicky, the name, but at the same time, I do think it has good staying power. So I think this is a great blush to check out. I don't think it gets as much hype as it used to, but it's still a very solid formula. Okay, one that I do not recommend, this one has been on the market probably longer than any of these other ones, the Covergirl Cheekers Blush. The price on these has gone up. I remember when these used to be like $3 or $4. Now on Ulta they're like $6.49, so they've crept up in price, like most things have. But there's a couple reasons why I don't recommend these. One reason is the packaging is so annoying. If they would change the packaging on these, I might be willing to give some other shades another chance, but they just have that very thin rectangular pan, and I really like to use a fluffy blush brush, so that alone is enough for me to not want to buy any more of these blushes. But I've had 2 shades of this in the past, and they were very different. One of them was the shade Natural Twinkle, which I actually used a lot of. I liked it for a long time, but there was nothing really to write home about with that one. And it also had glitter in it, little pieces of sparkle throughout it. Even though on the cheeks it would look mostly matte, if you looked up close you'd see little flecks of shimmer on there. So that also made it feel just kind of cheap. And also that one was just a bit sheer. Even though it looked pretty once I had it on, there was just nothing special about it. The other shade I've had was the shade Soft Sable, and that one was so muddy and patchy on me. That one was more of like a almost metallic luminous type of formula, sort of like Milani Luminoso, but not nearly as flattering. In fact, it was unflattering. It looked like I had a highlighter that was too dark all over my cheeks. Maybe that color would look better on deeper skin tones, but even despite it looking too dark on me, it was just very patchy and hard to work with. So even though the Covergirl Cheekers blushes have been out forever, they're kind of almost like an iconic product at this point, I just think there are so many better blushes out there now for an even lower price point that I think you can definitely skip those. Another one that, honestly, I would skip, this is a pretty affordable one. This is $6. It's the LA Girl Soft Matte Cream Blush. This one isn't horrible. I would say this is somewhere in the middle for me. It's not a total dud, but it's not a favorite either. I have the shade Rosebud in this, and if you saw my video recently where I compared drugstore and high-end products on either side of my face, this was the drugstore blush that I used, and I compared it to the About Face blush in a similar shade. The thing about this blush is that it is very pigmented. Like, this might as well be a liquid lipstick. So I will normally put some on the back of my hand, kind of blend it out with a finger, and then pick that up on a brush and apply it. It is nowhere near as easy to work with as something like the NYX Sweet Cheeks Blush. You have to be very careful with it. And on top of that, it can be a little bit patchy as well. Another couple of minor complaints. Number one, it does have a scent. I think it's the only one out of these that has any sort of scent. Just kind of a light perfumey scent. I don't really notice it once it's on my cheeks, but if you're really sensitive to scents or you're allergic to fragrance, definitely steer clear of this one. The other thing I want to point out that I feel like just makes it feel cheap is the fact that it has little bits of glitter in it. even though they call it a matte blush. It's not like a pearly sheen or anything, it just has little bits of sparkle in it that don't really do anything, but to me they just don't need to be there. Like, I would just prefer a straight matte, no glitter. If it's gonna be matte, just make it matte, you know? So one thing I do like about this though is that it has very good staying power. If you saw that drugstore versus high-end video, this actually stayed on my cheeks better than the About Face one. It didn't fade at all. If anything, it looked like a little too much on my cheeks, but it does have staying power. So I will give it that, but that, to me, is not enough to make up for the other negatives about it. So this is another one that I wouldn't really recommend. I'm bummed because I had really high hopes for it. It looks really cute. Looks similar to the NYX one, but it's nowhere near as good. Next up, a cream blush that is only $5. This is the e.l.f. Monochromatic Multi-Stick. I used this up a long time ago, but I loved this stick blush. I had the shade Glistening Peach. This was another luminous blush. Now, I actually think the e.l.f. Monochromatic Multi-Stick is a better luminous blush than the Luminous Putty because it's not quite as shiny and almost tacky. It has that pearly glow. I don't find it glittery. I know some people have said they feel like those are too sparkly glittery. To me, it just had more of like a fine shimmer to it. I didn't find it necessarily glittery, but I liked that one because it did come in a stick and I would just draw it straight onto my cheeks, blend it out with a brush, and it would blend out so easily. Didn't look patchy or anything, and that one is actually a couple dollars cheaper than the Luminous Putty. So even though that one has been out for a long time, don't overlook it because I think it is a really solid cream blush. The last blush, this is also the most affordable and also one of my favorites. This is the Essence The Blush in the shade Be Fitting. This is another one I've been raving about all year. This is such a great blush. Another powder. This one has more of a satin finish to it, like a very soft satin, but there's no shimmer to it. To me, this is one of those drugstore products, aside from the packaging, that the product itself feels way more expensive than it is. Like, it also has that very smooth, almost buttery texture, super easy to work with. This shade has been like my go-to shade this year. I've said many times, but this is that color that whenever I don't know what blush to wear, this is the one I go for because this is just that right in between neutral tone that will just tie any look together. It's not going to clash with anything, and it's also just so effortless and easy to work with. So even if you're on a super tight budget, you can absolutely find an amazing blush at the drugstore. Highly recommend this one. I know I've also seen they have the Essence Mosaic blushes, which I've heard amazing things about. I haven't tried those myself, but I would like to try those at some point. Does Essence make any cream blushes? I don't know if they do. I think that's the one area where they're kind of lacking is in the cream cheek product. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like they don't really make any cream cheek products. If they did though, I would definitely want to try it. But yeah, Essence The Blush, this is one of my favorites on this list. I just bought this earlier this year and I've already used so much of it, so that is one of my top picks as well. So those are the best and worst of all the drugstore blushes that I've tried. I've apparently tried a lot of them. I feel like this is quite a few blushes. And if you didn't notice, there were way more blushes that I really love and do recommend versus ones that I don't recommend. So I think that just goes to show there are so many amazing drugstore blushes out there. Let me know if there's any I didn't mention that you think I would like because I'm always on the hunt for new blushes. It's that kind of my weakness. I love testing new blushes. I have too many as it is, so I don't need to buy any more, but I'm always willing to add some more blushes to my wish list, so let me know if there are any more you think I should try. But thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hopefully I will talk to you tomorrow in my next video. Bye!